Video games have a serious amnesia problem. For decades, video game protagonists have had an alarmingly high rate of amnesia, not just compared to real people, but even compared to characters in other media. From Fallout New Vegas' Wasteland Drifter, to Amnesia the Dark Descent's Hapless Archaeologist, to Final Fantasy VIII's Military Brats, and more recently, the deadbeat detective in Disco Elysium. This begs the question, why do games fall back on amnesia so often? And what can we do to reel in this tendency? As far as I can tell, there are three real reasons games use amnesia. First, it's an easy excuse to insert world-building exposition that a normal person wouldn't need. Do you have a pervasive setting element that's important for your players to understand, but there's no reason for regular people to be teaching each other about it? Just give the protagonist amnesia, and now you can have all the wordy explanations you need. Disco Elysium literally has a quest where you are tasked with finding a well-educated person to explain to you the history and physics of the setting. She explains the political backdrop of the world, the war that leaves its mark on your little slum to this day, and the supernatural pale that surrounds the island and drives sailors to madness. The second reason for amnesia's ever-presence is that it makes adding twists to your game dead simple. When your character's entire life is a mystery to them, it's easy for painful or shameful elements of that past to come back and bite them at inopportune moments. Silent Hill loves to do this, and Disco Elysium throws a few curveballs your way as well, which I will avoid spoiling. The last, and lamest, reason for games to overuse amnesia is to allow the protagonist to be a player insert while still having baggage. By giving the protagonist amnesia, you create a degree of separation between their life and them, allowing you, the player, to casually assume the role of person who's learning about their past for the first time. This is important for setting up all of those gut punch reveals, because the developers want you to feel like you're the one who did all this bad stuff in the protagonist's past. This is especially prominent in Disco Elysium, as the game devotes a lot of time and effort to the detective's intrusive thoughts, forcing you to live inside the detective's head. When you frame it like this, it's easy to understand why amnesia is such a popular writing device, especially in games. You mean I get a shortcut to making my player relate to their character, and I get a free pass to dump as much exposition as I want? Well, what's the catch? Well, the catch is simple. It doesn't work. Let's walk through this point by point. The problem with exposition isn't just that it's weird for people to randomly inform you about basic setting elements. That is weird, don't get me wrong, but the much larger problem is that explicit exposition is boring. There are better ways of informing the player about the setting, and any game will have to use these techniques regardless of how much exposition is also included. Disco Elysium in particular has some rather well-executed world building. The workers' strike in the streets tells us about the class conflict, as well as some common occupations in Martinez. The bullet holes and half-destroyed infrastructure tell us that this city is war-scarred and only half rebuilt. And the poverty is self-evident. There is so much setting detail that you pick up just by walking around Martinez without anyone having to explain it to you. Not only that, but when you do need to devote a scene to explaining setting details to the player, there are much better ways to do it. For an example, let's compare that learning about the setting quest to another much better scene in Disco Elysium that explains much of the same information. In our learning quest, Get a Reality Lowdown, we seek out the only friendly, educated person in town and ask them to explain the setting for us. She then stands on her boat and gives you a dissertation on the history, politics, and physics of the place, after which you thank her and go about your business. It's dry, it feels pointless, and although they try to inject a little character into it here and there, it doesn't help much because the explanation itself is so unmotivated and awkward. But here's where it gets really bad. Most of what our reality teacher describes for us has already been explained in a much more interesting scene. Down the docks, in a ditch, playing this game's equivalent of horseshoes, are a pair of old men named Rene and Gaston. Renee is a fiery war veteran who would be out there on the front lines fighting to this day if there was still a war to fight. While Gaston is an artist who prefers the relative peace and simplicity of their current life, regardless of the political and socioeconomic backdrop. These two men lived through the war, and they have strong opinions about the events of their day. For them, this is not history. It's their lives, and they're still living it. When you speak with these men, an ongoing argument about the state of the world and the mistakes of the past spills forth without almost any prodding on your part. Renee is full of contempt for Gaston, whom he considers a coward, and he longs for the days when his people fought for the right of self-governance. Gaston, on the other hand, thinks Renee's nationalistic ideals don't justify the horrific loss of life brought on by the war, and is happy to let it all slide. Renee fought long and hard for his people, and has stories about his war heroics. He rages at Gaston for not taking up arms to defend his land, allowing foreign powers to take over without a fight. This scene works so much better to explain the history of Martinaise because it's full of character and drama. Renee and Gaston don't just deliver a lecture in cold, callous third person, they tell us their stories, complete with all of the editorializing that real people do to justify their beliefs and strengthen their arguments. You learn about the setting, but you also learn about Renee and Gaston through the way they describe their setting, through their personal convictions and regrets. Not only that, but because they have real beef with each other, these conversations are heated and nuanced. Renee lashes out near violently against Gaston, while Gaston timidly deflects and redirects. There's tension in the conversation, and that makes the scene engaging. When you inject character, drama, and tension into your exposition, it pops. It makes the scene feel weighty and the exposition easier to swallow. By contrast, Get a Reality Lowdown is stiff, awkward, and rambling, because our wealthy teacher has no personal stake in the scene. She's knowledgeable about history, and she has some opinions here and there, but she's not invested in it. There's no drama, no tension, and we aren't fleshing out or demonstrating her character. It's just exposition. Amnesia doesn't make exposition more interesting. What Amnesia does to a story is much more insidious. It justifies exposition. See, if Disco Elysium's detective didn't have amnesia, the developers would have had to figure out some compelling reason why a character would dump all of this information on you. Renee and Gaston have a reason for teaching you about Martinet's history. They lived it, and live it still in their minds. So what about the other half of Get a Reality Lowdown? The exposition quest tells us about history and about the Pale, but Renee and Gaston only teach us about history. How can we learn about the Pale without a textbook to explain it to us? By seeing its effects for ourselves. It would be so much more impactful, so much more memorable, and make more sense in the setting if instead of being told about the Pale, we got to see its effects and draw our own conclusions. The Pale is a miasma that surrounds your island, and passing through it is both difficult and dangerous. Prolonged exposure to the Pale drives sailors mad and ravages their bodies with illness. Why do we never see these things happen? It's explained to us, and then it lives as a setting detail for us to wonder about. So, Amnesia doesn't make exposition better. It just gives writers an excuse to have more poorly framed exposition. But what about twists? Surely Amnesia is a twist machine. There could be anything lingering in an amnesiac's past. Well, that's true. But there could be anything lingering in anyone's past. A good twist doesn't have to be a surprise to the protagonist, even in a game. One of the most famous reveals from a protagonist's backstory in all of gaming, James Sunderland's Big Secret, works whether James remembered the event beforehand or not. It's not important for James to learn the information. It's important for us, the audience, to learn the information. What's important for James is to process the information. Silent Hill 2 never makes it clear whether James conveniently forgot important events from his past, or if he simply refused to acknowledge them. It's far more likely, realistically, that he simply didn't want to face the truth. But what's important here is that this type of reveal works. By denying the truth to himself, James hides the truth from the player. When he is forced to face the truth, we are able to learn the truth. And what does Amnesia add to this? Nothing, really. A character who is ashamed of their past and wants to make up for it without acknowledging it is virtually identical to a character who doesn't remember their past at all and has to piece it together. The biggest difference is that the story beats actually hit harder if the protagonist is forced to take ownership of them, instead of distancing them from it by making it feel like a separate life. Disco Elysium is pretty bad about this, honestly. Nothing that the detective has done is really even a plot-relevant twist, and the majority of the reveals fall into one of two categories. First, actions he took while blackout drunk that could have easily been forgotten through the more plausible effects of overdrinking, and that he even could have remembered and just been ashamed of and scared to admit. And second, reveals that, frankly, aren't reveals at all. I won't spoil them here, but for those of you who played the game, did the big reveal of your detective's name really change anything in the narrative? Didn't the situation with the gun feel much more significant? None of the things that Disco Elysium's protagonist forgets turn out to be important, and learning those things only has loose thematic relevance to his journey of self-rediscovery and potential change. His journey has nothing to do with his past, and everything to do with how he moves forward. The last point in favor of Amnesia as a writing device is that it makes the protagonist a better player insert. By robbing the protagonist of their past, we make them a blank slate for the player to project onto. It's okay that we don't know their past, because neither do they. Except this really doesn't work either, because a character's backstory doesn't define them for the audience, their personality and appearance do. Unless the game is in first person, with no modeled body and no player dialogue, the game is already making assumptions about the protagonist which the player will have to buy into. You have to buy into looking and dressing the way the protagonist does, into speaking the way the protagonist speaks, and thinking the way the protagonist thinks, and even doing whatever it is that the protagonist is required to do. Disco Elysium in particular presupposes a lot about the protagonist that makes him a poor player insert. It asserts his gender, it asserts the way he dresses, it asserts that he chose to become a detective even if he no longer remembers doing so. It asserts that he's a drug-riddled alcoholic who binge-drank himself to the point of nearly dying of alcohol poisoning, and it even asserts that he's single and bitter about his ex. That's a lot of things to assert while trying to be a blank slate. As someone who's happily married, rarely drinks alcohol, and has never even had weed, let alone anything actually hard, I needed just as much buy-in for Disco Elysium as I would have if the protagonist had a name and remembered his bad breakup. This is similar to the problem with silent protagonists in games, a problem that Breath of the Wild, and its own amnesiac Link, butted up against relatively recently. If you want to write an engaging story that revolves around the player character's personal life, it is explicitly necessary for you to define that character and give them traits. The protagonist can't be a player insert, because the game can't tailor itself to the player's life. The romance between Link and his Zora girlfriend was painfully awkward, because it was just scenes of her waxing poetic about her undying love for Link, while he stares blankly at her and fails to respond. Her limited screen time didn't help at all, but the core of the problem was writing a personal story about a person who's not allowed to have any agency, express any opinions, or engage with their surroundings. Amnesia doesn't make characters into blank slates, because characters are not defined by their backstory. They're defined by their personality and their choices. Some of these choices and personality can be left to the player, but The game is always going to assert something about the protagonist, and the most important aspects that have to be omitted or defined have nothing to do with the character's memory. Even in games with a great deal of role-playing choice for the player, developers still make decisions about the character by choosing what options to include, what options to omit, and how to word those options, as well as how it's voice acted, if at all. Take Mass Effect, for example. These games are chock full of dialogue options, as well as separate gendered Shepards with separate voice actors and full appearance customization. But Commander Shepard still has defined, inalienable traits. Shepard is always assertive, competent, determined, courageous, and snarky, because these are the traits that BioWare believes make a hero. And regardless of what dialogue choices you pick, what background you take, or how gross you make their face, Shepard is always a hero. So, altogether, Amnesia is not nearly as effective a writing tool as it might seem. It's an easy, cheap tool that excuses weak writing more often than it enables good writing. On top of that, it's been so wildly overused, it elicits eye rolls anytime it comes up. Oh boy, another amnesiac protagonist. Of course. There's one last reason that the abundance of amnesiac protagonists in gaming bothers me. Amnesia is a real disability. It's not just some clever writing trick that someone devised long ago. It's a real thing that affects real people. And none of the games that feature amnesia are actually about amnesia. Amnesia is used as a tool to accomplish unrelated narrative goals, but the realities of living with amnesia are almost never actually addressed. I would love a story about a character with amnesia whose core conflict actually stemmed from that amnesia. Amnesia is a terrifying, monstrous effect that turns loved ones into strangers and invalidates decades of your life. For a piece of media to seriously confront that and deal with it in a mature way would be great. But that's not what we get. Instead, amnesia is treated as a throwaway pulp trope like zombies or femme fatales. So, next time you play a game where the protagonist has amnesia, ask yourself what the story actually gains from it. Would the narrative still work if the protagonist didn't have amnesia? How much would have to change? Would it still hold up? And if you've played a game that handles amnesia maturely, or whose narrative genuinely wouldn't work without amnesia, hit me up, because I'd love to hear about it. Personally, although I think Link's memory in Breath of the Wild is handled poorly in a lot of other ways, I'm a big fan of the photo hunting mechanic. Early in the game, Link gets a photo album of places that Link and Zelda visited together during their travels in Hyrule. These 25 photos are Link's only, well, link to his past. Seeking out these locations to try and remember what made them significant to Zelda and Link dovetails beautifully with the game's open, exploratory nature, and the mechanic would have been a lot less powerful if it weren't tied to Link's relationship with Zelda. Oh, and if you want an example of a piece of media handling amnesia really well, I would recommend Christopher Nolan's breakout film Memento.
I have this condition.
A condition?
It's my memory.
Amnesia?
No. It's different from that.